would acquire all his drill cores at great expense, but they would never find anybody who was interested in working on it. If they'd worked on it, they might have discovered platinum, palladium and gold and stuff in these cores, but they didn't.
Welcome to Polar Podcasts, where you'll hear stories from geologists who've spent their careers, their lives, exploring and studying the remarkable and remote geology of Greenland. Why did they become fascinated with Greenland? What were the problems and the discoveries that drove them? And what was it like working in these remote places, where few people venture, even now? I'm Julie Holtz. In this episode, we hear more from Kent Brooks, Emeritus Professor at the Geological Museum in Copenhagen, about the Skaregard intrusion, which he first encountered on a geological expedition in 1966, and which was to become the focus of his long career working in East Greenland, about his move away from Oxford to Copenhagen, forays into studying the unique geology of South Greenland, and being drawn back to East Greenland, where his research interests would be firmly rooted for the decades ahead.
The Skaregard intrusion in East Greenland, it belongs to a class of igneous rocks known as layered igneous intrusions, where basaltic magmas intruded the Earth's crust and solidified in so-called magma chambers. In doing this, it undergoes differentiation. That is, the high temperature minerals crystallize first and they separate out, leaving a liquid behind which is a different composition, a liquid or melt behind which is a different composition. And in this way it's thought that the spectrum of various igneous rocks have largely been formed. And so a study of layered intrusions will show the processes which take place in silicate magmas leading to the various igneous rocks which we have at the present time. As anyone can imagine, it's extremely difficult studying this business because magmas come out at the Earth's surface as lava flows, and they're easy enough to study. But if they stop in the Earth's crust, several kilometres down the Earth's crust, and differentiate there, it's virtually impossible to study in situ. You can only study it when the magma chamber has cooled, been uplifted and eroded away and exposed on the surface. Now in 1931 or 1930, Wager found the Skaregard intrusion, Kangerlussuaq, which lies 400 kilometres north of Tasiilaq in East Greenland.
Lawrence Wager was professor at Oxford in his later years and Kent's supervisor.
He was part of the British Arctic Air Route expedition, which had the base camp at Supertok to the west of Serminik Fjord. This was the first expedition to Greenland which made use of aircraft. They had 2 gypsy moths, and they took spectacular air photographs of large areas of unknown East Greenland, including the basalts of the Blosseville coast. They sailed up in the expedition ship to Kangerlussuaq, and Wager discovered this intrusion, which previously had been thought to be made of sandstone. He identified as being layered gabbro, which the layering, when seen from a distance, looked like a sedimentary rock, and the brownish colour looked like sandstone. The Skaregard gabbros are brownish, rusty coloured rocks because they have an high iron content. Wager recognised that the Skaregard intrusion would be an excellent place to study the processes going on within the Earth's crust as magmas differentiate. And he organised an expedition in 1935 to 36, an overwintering expedition, which he crammed into a very active life of becoming a professor at Durham, first at Reading and then at Durham, subsequently at Oxford, and an attempt to climb Everest, where he got to be the highest mountaineer in the world in 1933, I think, 1934 maybe. And he sailed with Einar Mikkelsen down the East Greenland coast in 1933. So they overwintered in Kangerlussuaq, not only working on the Skaregard intrusion, but doing a large regional study as well, and covering huge areas of country by dog sledge. They overwintered there along with a family from Ermasadik, who wanted seals for them, so they lived mainly off the land. Yeah. Wager and Deer published their work on the Skaregod intrusion in 1939. Although the war had broken out at this time, it immediately became a required reading for just about every geologist in the world, because it showed clearly the sort of processes that had been prognosticated by Norman Bowen using experimental techniques on silicate melts. They returned to the Skaregod intrusion again in 1953 to augment the sample they had and do further mapping, and working on several of the intrusions in the neighbourhood. At this time, they not only, the emphasis was on looking at the processes in which differentiation had taken place, but also it was directed to showing the behaviour of many obscure chemical elements in differentiating magmas. How do elements like zirconium and uranium and strontium and rubidium behave when basaltic magma differentiates? The study of layered intrusion not only tells us how basaltic magmas behave on Earth, tells us how the differentiation took place in the planetary bodies of the solar system, so that different types of meteorites can be explained by similar processes. Also, the generation of important economic deposits of minerals can be generated by these differentiation processes. For example, the group of ore deposits known as orthomagmatic ore deposits, which are closely related to igneous rocks, and these include minerals such as nickel, platinum, copper, and several others. For example, the world's largest platinum deposit is found in the Bushveld intrusion of South Africa, which is an immense layered intrusion about the size of Scotland. And the world's largest nickel deposits are found in the Sudbury complex of Ontario, which is also a layered intrusion. Wager had been at some geological meeting in California, and he'd heard about the Mohole project, which was a project in those days to use a barge to drill through the ocean crust into the mantle. It never came off because they didn't get the funding for it, but it aroused Wager's interest in maybe drilling the Skaregod intrusion using the same barge, which could be towed into Uttental Sund and drill there. But that was quickly disabused of that idea, because the barge wasn't certified for going to ice-filled waters, so they couldn't take the barge to the Arctic. But it did spark off the idea it would drill the Skaregod intrusion, and so they hired the Canadian firm Longyear to do diamond drilling there. And they hired a ship from Ålesund, a sealing vessel from Ålesund called Polaric, to transport the expedition there. Polaric came to King's Lynn, which was the nearest port to Cambridge, and took the expedition on board there. In the meantime, however, Wager had died, and so the expedition was now run by Deer, and Deer didn't have the same enthusiasm, I feel, that Wager would have had. Wager actually, the preceding November, he went to London to visit his photographer to buy a new camera. I mean, he was incredibly old-fashioned, was Wager. He couldn't go down to Boots and buy a camera from Boots. He had to go to some fancy photographer in the West End of London and buy a specially recommended Leica. Anyhow, he bought this Leica from the shop in London and went out onto Piccadilly and collapsed. And he'd had a heart attack and died there on the spot. So he never took part in the expedition. It was run by Deer, and it came to be called the Cambridge Expedition, which rather irritated me. Anyhow, this expedition was in several parts. It was one group were due to do the drilling on Skaregod, and also to collect samples of Skaregod gabbros with the idea of studying them for sedimentary features. Another party were led by Peter Brown, who at that time was professor at the University of Sheffield, would go to the Kialinek area, which at that time was unknown, just completely unknown. It's an area to the about 200 kilometres south of Kangerlussuaq, and there's an abundance of various sorts of tertiary intrusions there. And then after that they would go and study the Cap Edward Holm intrusion on the opposite side of Kangerlussuaq, which in the days when wader and deer has overwintered in Kangerlussuaq, deer had taken an interest in the Cap Edward Holm intrusion. It's a very much larger gabbroic complex than Skergård, perhaps three or four times the size, and is a product of multiple intrusions of basaltic magma. So they would study that. Curiously enough, Peter Brown was also an influence in me doing geology, because he'd been my next door neighbour during World War II, and at that time I think he was at the order of 15 years old. I was probably 4. But he and his brother, they'd set up in their attic a display of the Desert War, where they'd sprinkled sand all over the floor and made sand dunes. They had little tanks and things going through it, and he used to invite me in to see that. And anyhow, when I was leaving school, I thought I'd contact Peter Brown, ask him what I should do. I was thinking of doing geology, I told him. He said, "Oh, don't do geology," he said, "there's no future in that." Because this was at the time, of course, when the British Empire was collapsing, and all the geological surveys around the place in Africa and that the geologists were being fired. And Peter himself had been geologist in the Tanganyika survey, so he was familiar with that. Anyhow, he said, if you decide to ignore me, he said the best place to go is to Manchester. Of course, he would say that because that's where he'd got been. So anyhow, I went to Manchester to read geology there. I'll get back to the expedition and drilling Skergård. Well, we drilled the lower zone of Skergård and attempted to get into the hidden zone. And after about, I think, I don't remember what it was, 500 metres, I think, the drill showed signs of leaving the intrusion altogether. We were the drill was going out of the intrusion, so Deer decided we should drill somewhere else. So we moved the drill rig with great difficulty. We had to build a raft of bits of old telegraph poles and stuff from the demolished American World War II meteorological base. We had to build a raft with the telegraph poles and oil drums and float the rig down Uttendalsund and then winch it on shore there, and we drill a new hole at the foot of Uttendalsund, at the foot of Forbindelsens Glacier. Well, that's all very well. What we didn't realise at the time, and what we found out later on, was that we were drilling through a particularly exciting part of the stratigraphy of Skergård, where there's a precious metal concentration. But we had diamond core samples of that, but for some reason nobody showed any interest in working on this stuff. We'd acquired all these drill cores at great expense, but they could never find anybody who was interested in working on it. So it languished in a store in Cambridge for many years. If they'd worked on it, they might have discovered platinum, palladium, and gold and stuff in these cores, but they didn't. That was to be done by Platinova many years in the future. This was 1966.
But on returning to Oxford, Kent found that he had to deal with a new professor.
And I didn't see eye to eye with the new professor, and thought I'd move somewhere else. I was only on a limited contract, anyhow, a 3-year contract with the department. It wasn't sure it was going to be extended when the time, especially as I got at loggerheads with the professor. So I happened to be at the Geological Society in London one day, and in the gentleman's toilet I ran into Drever from St Andrews, and he said, "Have you heard they've got a job for somebody like you in Copenhagen?" I said, "No, I haven't heard that." And he said, "Well, get in touch with Professor Sørensen in Copenhagen," and that's what I did. And I went over to Copenhagen, had an interview there, and they decided to hire me. When I came back to Oxford, had an altercation with the professor there, and he said, if you don't like it here, Kent, you could get a job somewhere else. And I said, well, that's exactly what I'm doing, and I'll tender a resignation now. And he said, you're not serious, are you? People don't leave Oxford when they have a job in Oxford. I said, well, here's one person who is going to leave Oxford, which I did. Well, when I got to Copenhagen, a professor of the Petrologisk Institute was Henning Sørensen, and he'd worked for many years on the Illimausak intrusion in the neighbourhood of Narsaq.
In South Greenland.
And the whole institute was geared up to working on Illimausak, which is an incredibly interesting intrusion. It also has the disadvantage it's incredibly unusual. So whatever you find out about Illimausak doesn't have any real global consequences. It just applies to a very restricted group of rocks known as the Agphaetic rocks. Well, he had naturally assumed that I would take part in this summer jamboree up there, and so I worked on what's called the Kokotokites. They're the lowest rocks within the intrusion, and they're strongly layered. If you like to look at it that way, it's like a sort of exotic type of scargo, the layered igneous rocks. But in this case, they're highly alkaline, highly evolved, and they contain the rare mineral. What's otherwise a rare mineral eudialyte is a rock-forming mineral. Anyhow, I decided to work on the Kokotokites. Henning thought this was a good idea, and I had an assistant called Henning Boza, who, to my great chagrin, never finished his degree. He became a perpetual student, and then a perpetual advisor to mineral companies prospecting in the area. Every geologist who's worked in the area knows Henning Boza, and every prospecting company relied on his expertise to help her around. Well, my first idea was, you look at all these layers in the Kokotokites, it looks like a multi-layered cake with layers which consist of black at the bottom, then a red layer, then a white layer. So it looks like a sort of Battenberg cake, but many of these layers. And I thought the first thing to do would be to map the stratigraphy of it.
The relative position of the layers, one above the other.
We give each layer a number, and we collect a series of samples through it. And that we did. There were 33 layers, I think. And so we started off at layer 0, which was somewhere in the middle, and we went down to minus numbers and then up to plus numbers. And we had this collection of rocks which Henning Boza was supposed to work on, but he never did because he was most interested in going to Greenland. And every year when he'd been in the field, he came back and he spent the time between coming home in September and Christmas tidying up his results and writing his field notebooks and various things. And then when I expected he'd get on with doing the work in January, he'd start preparing for the next year's field work. And this more or less went on for 50 years, I guess, for 40 years maybe. Anyhow, I spent 2 years on this project at Illimausak, but it wasn't really my thing because they didn't really seem to be going anywhere. They went up there every year and they did various things with the Atomic Energy Commission and looked at various outcrops that were mystifying, and they'd look at the outcrop and say, isn't this mystifying? And then they'd not do anything about it. They'd come back next year and say, what is a mystifying outcrop? It was all very well. It kept the Institute busy, and many students graduated on that. Some of them they did very good work, in fact, and went on to shining careers. People like Agneta Steenfeldt and Lotte Melchior Larsen. But it might have been a good project for them, but it certainly wasn't the sort of thing that I wanted. So my interest started to return to East Greenland, and I thought that it was very promising to look at the igneous rocks around Kangerlussuaq. That Wager had done a wonderful job in his time. He effectively mapped a huge area of country extending from south of Ammassalik, where the British Arctic Air Route had its base, to essentially up to Scoresby Sund, an area of country that must be in excess of, I don't know, probably in excess of 70,000 square kilometres. And he'd done all this from the deck of a ship and by walking around various places. So Wade did a tremendous job there, quite naturally. A lot of stuff I hadn't seen, and I decided it was time to start tidying up the loose ends there, which is what we did. But I came into it not as a university project, because I just decided an area I'd like to work in, and it came to my attention that the Nordic Mining Company had taken a concession there, and so I descended on the Northern Mining Company to push my case for being one of the prospectors.
I'm Julie Hollis, and you've been listening to Polar Podcasts. In the next episode, we hear more from Emeritus Senior Scientist Niels Henriksen about his years spent mapping the Caledonian foldberg